The great chamber of the Galactic Defense Coalition stretched out like a crystal cave filled with stars. Beings from across the known galaxy sat in floating seats that adjusted to each species' unique needs. The air hummed with translation devices working overtime as dozens of alien languages mixed together. Commander Vexhai of the Zarathi Empire tapped his 6 fingers against the control panel in front of him. His people were known throughout the galaxy for their perfect logic and superior intellect. Their tall, thin bodies and large heads housed brains that could process information faster than most organic computers. Today, like every other day, Vexhai felt confident in his people's place at the top of galactic civilization. Admiral Takesh sat across the chamber. Her forearms crossed in a gesture that showed her growing impatience. The Korthani were warriors by nature, bred for battle across 1,000 generations. Their thick, armored skin could stop most energy weapons, and their natural strength was legendary. Takesh had personally led fleets that conquered entire star systems. She had little patience for bureaucratic meetings, but the Coalition's military decisions required her input. Between them floated the jellyfish-like form of High Technician Zralmoth. The Valaxians had transcended physical limitations long ago, their consciousness existing in energy fields that could manipulate matter at the molecular level. They built weapons that could crack planets and shields that had never been breached. Zralmoth rarely spoke, but when they did, others listened. Next application for Coalition membership, announced the Chamber's AI in a voice that somehow managed to sound bored. A holographic display materialized in the center of the room, showing a small blue planet orbiting a yellow star. Earth, Vexhai read from his datapad, his voice carrying the tone of someone reading a grocery list. Sol System, Orion Arm, Milky Way Galaxy. Species designation, human. The display showed images of the planet's surface. Cities with primitive transportation systems, land masses covered in what appeared to be agricultural areas and large bodies of water. Takesh leaned forward in her seat, her warrior instincts automatically analyzing what she saw. Their technology assessment is interesting, she said, though her tone suggested the opposite. More images flashed across the display. Vehicles that moved on wheels, aircraft that required physical wings to fly, and ships that floated on water instead of manipulating gravity fields. Zralmoth's energy field pulsed in what others had learned to recognize as amusement. Their fastest ships use controlled chemical explosions for propulsion. They still burn organic matter for energy in many regions. A few chuckles echoed through the chamber. Even the more serious members of the Coalition found humor in such primitive methods. The Zarathi had abandoned chemical propulsion over 50,000 years ago. The Korthani had been using fusion drives when humans were still discovering fire. Let us review their military capabilities, Vexhai said, calling up the next section of data. What appeared on screen made several Coalition members laugh openly. The humans' weapons were almost comically simple. Metal tubes that used controlled explosions to launch small metal projectiles, vehicles that moved on tracks or wheels instead of hovering above the ground, aircraft that required air to flow over wings instead of manipulating gravitational fields. They still use chemical explosives as their primary source of destructive force, Admiral Takesh noted, her mandibles clicking in what passed for laughter among her people. And look at their soldiers. The display showed images of human military personnel. They appeared to be mammals, walking upright on 2 legs with soft skin that offered no natural protection. Their weapons looked heavy and clumsy, requiring physical strength to operate effectively. No natural armor, observed a Coalition member from the insect-like Chitani collective. No energy manipulation abilities. They cannot even survive in vacuum without artificial protection. Their reaction times are pathetically slow compared to enhanced beings, added another representative. And they require 8 hours of unconsciousness every day just to function properly. More laughter filled the chamber. The idea that such primitive creatures thought they could contribute to galactic defense was genuinely amusing to most present. Vexhai scrolled through more data on his pad. According to their application, they have engaged in warfare among their own species for their entire recorded history. They seem to consider this a qualification for Coalition membership. This brought the loudest laughter yet. The advanced civilizations of the Coalition had evolved beyond internal conflict long ago. War was something they engaged in against external threats like the savage Zephyrian horde that currently threatened the Outer Rim territories. The idea that a species would fight among itself was viewed as evidence of their primitive nature. They have provided tactical analysis of several historical conflicts, Takesh said, scanning through the files with professional interest despite her amusement. Battle of Stalingrad, Operation Overlord, Siege of... Many names I cannot pronounce. She paused as she read deeper into the files. These conflicts involved millions of casualties on each side. The humans appear to have continued fighting even when facing complete defeat. Stubborn and stupid, commented Zralmoth. A dangerous combination in primitive species. The Chamber's AI announced that voting on the application would begin. As expected, the decision was swift and unanimous. Earth's application for full coalition membership was denied by every single representative present. However, Vexai announced, as the official rejection was recorded, the coalition offers Earth observer status during our current military operations against the Zephyrian Horde. Perhaps exposure to proper military tactics will help them evolve beyond their current limitations. The offer was made in the spirit of charitable education, like giving toys to children to help them learn. Several coalition members voiced their approval of this generous gesture. The humans could watch real warriors in action and maybe learn something useful. Admiral Takesh was already thinking about how to position the human observers where they could get the best view without interfering with actual military operations. We could assign them to support roles. Supply transport, perhaps, or medical assistance to our wounded. They might find our advanced medical techniques educational, agreed Zralmoth, though I doubt they could understand the principles involved. The meeting moved on to other business. Plans for the next offensive against the Zephyrian Horde, resource allocation for the war effort, and updates from the front lines where coalition forces were struggling against an unexpectedly adaptable enemy. Nobody paid much attention when the Chamber's AI announced that Earth had accepted observer status and would be sending a military contingent to the next operation. The humans were just another primitive species that might eventually evolve into something useful if they survived long enough. Captain Sarah Chen of the Terran Defense Force received the Coalition's response aboard the orbital station that served as Earth's primary military command center. She read through the rejection letter twice, her jaw tightening with each condescending phrase. Observer status, she muttered to her aide, Lieutenant Morrison. They want us to watch and learn from our betters. Morrison, a veteran of 3 different Earth conflicts, shook his head. Do they know we've been fighting wars since before we could write, ma'am? Chen looked out through the station's viewport at the blue marble of Earth below. Somewhere down there, factories were already producing the equipment their observation mission would require. The Coalition thought they were sending students to watch a lecture. They had no idea they were about to get a practical demonstration. Prepare the 1st Marine Expeditionary Unit for deployment, Chen ordered. Full combat loadout. If we're going to observe, we might as well be ready to participate. 3 months had passed since the Coalition's rejection of Earth's membership application. What had started as a routine military operation against the Zephyrian Horde had become a nightmare that shook the very foundations of galactic civilization. The war room aboard the Coalition flagship Eternal, Victory buzzed with tension and barely controlled panic. Admiral Takesh stood before a massive holographic display showing the current state of the conflict. Red markers indicated lost territories, and there were far too many of them. Report, she commanded. Her forearms crossed in a gesture that her subordinates had learned meant someone was about to receive very bad news. Commander Vexai approached with a data tablet, his usually confident demeanor replaced by something approaching fear. We have lost 7 more systems in the past week. The Horde's bioships continue to adapt faster than our weapons can be modified to counter them. The Zephyrian Horde was unlike any enemy the Coalition had faced before. They did not use technology in the traditional sense. Instead, they grew their ships and weapons from living tissue that could evolve and adapt in real time. Energy weapons that worked perfectly in one battle would be completely ineffective in the next, as the Horde's organisms developed immunity. What about the Valaxian superweapons? Takesh asked, though she already knew the answer from Vexai's expression. High Technician Zralmoth reports that their planetary defense grid on Nexus Prime has been breached. The bioship somehow learned to absorb and redirect their energy shields. 3 billion Valaxians are currently evacuating to emergency shelters. Takesh felt her secondary heart skip a beat. Nexus Prime was supposed to be impregnable. The Valaxians had spent centuries perfecting its defenses. creating weapons that could theoretically destroy entire solar systems. If the Horde could breach those defenses, nowhere in Coalition space was safe. Casualties? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Combined Coalition losses now exceed 40 billion military personnel and 200 billion civilians. Vex-High replied quietly. At current rates of loss, we will be unable to maintain defensive lines within 6 more months. The number was staggering. The Coalition represented over 300 species across thousands of star systems. They had armies that numbered in the trillions, and technology that had remained unchallenged for millennia. The idea that they could lose a war had been unthinkable just a few months ago. Options? Takesh demanded. Vex-High hesitated before answering. The Strategic Command has identified several possible courses of action. We could attempt to evacuate core systems and establish a defensive perimeter around the galactic center. We could try to negotiate a ceasefire with the Horde leadership. Or we could request military assistance from species currently holding observer status. The war room fell silent. Everyone present understood what that meant. The Coalition would be asking for help from the primitive civilizations they had dismissed as irrelevant. It was the admission of failure that went against everything they believed about their superiority. The humans, Takesh said finally. Among others, yes. Earth has a military contingent already en route to observe our operations in the Kepler 442 system. We could expand their role. Takesh looked at the strategic display again. The Kepler 442 system was considered a minor front, more of a nuisance than a real threat. The Horde presence there consisted mainly of scout organisms and forward scouts. It would be the perfect place to test whether primitive weapons could have any effect at all against bioships. What do we know about their actual combat capabilities? She asked. Vex-High pulled up the human military files again. The data still looked primitive and amusing, but desperation had a way of changing perspective. They claim extensive experience in what they call asymmetric warfare, fighting against enemies with superior technology using improvised tactics and persistent attacks. Their weapons? Still primarily kinetic projectiles and chemical explosives. However, they appear to have a wide variety of specialized munitions. Armor-piercing, incendiary, explosive, and several types we do not have proper translations for. Takesh studied the images of human soldiers again. They still looked soft and vulnerable, but something about their posture suggested confidence rather than ignorance. These beings had volunteered to travel across the galaxy to observe a war they had no stake in. Their commanding officer? Captain Sarah Chen, Terran Defense Force combat veteran of multiple planetary conflicts. Her service record indicates participation in over 200 separate military operations. 200 operations for a single individual seemed excessive until Takesh remembered that humans had much shorter lifespans than most Coalition species. This Captain Chen had apparently spent most of her adult life fighting wars. Contact the human contingent, Takesh ordered. Inform them that their observer status has been expanded to include limited combat operations. They are authorized to engage Horde forces in the Kepler 442 system as a training exercise. The communication was sent through standard diplomatic channels, couched in language that made it clear the Coalition was doing the humans a favor by allowing them to participate. Nobody mentioned that Coalition. Forces had already been driven out of most of the Kepler 442 system. Captain Chen received the message aboard the human transport ship. Resilience as it traveled through hyperspace toward the battle zone. She read through the formal authorization twice before calling her senior staff to the briefing room. Ladies and gentlemen, our observer mission has been upgraded, she announced to the assembled officers. We're now authorized for limited combat operations against Horde forces. Major Rodriguez, commander of the 1st Battalion, leaned forward in his chair. What kind of limitations are we talking about, ma'am? The good news is that we're cleared to engage any Horde forces we encounter in the target system. The bad news is that Coalition Command expects us to lose badly enough that it will serve as an educational experience. Lieutenant Colonel Park, the unit's intelligence officer, pulled up tactical data on her tablet. What do we know about these bioships? They adapt to energy weapons by evolving immunity. They use living tissue for armor and weapons. They reproduce rapidly and coordinate through some kind of biological network, Chen summarized. Coalition forces have been consistently defeated because their weapons become ineffective after initial contact. Rodriguez smiled grimly. Sounds like they haven't tried shooting them with enough bullets yet. That's essentially our job. The Coalition wants to see if kinetic weapons have any effect on adaptive organic armor. Chen stood and walked to the tactical display. Rules of engagement are simple. Anything that's not Coalition or civilian is fair game. We have full authorization to use any weapons in our arsenal. The assembled officers exchanged glances that mixed anticipation with professional caution. They were career soldiers who had spent their lives fighting wars against other humans. The prospect of fighting aliens was both exciting and sobering. "Timeline?" asked Major Harrison, the logistics officer. "We drop out of hyperspace in 18 hours. Coalition intelligence indicates moderate horde presence on 3 planets and at least a dozen bioships in system. Our mission is to assess their capabilities and report back." Chen looked around the room at faces that showed no fear, only professional interest. These were people who had volunteered for a mission that took them away from Earth for an indefinite period to fight in someone else's war. The Coalition thought it was sending them to learn harsh lessons about modern warfare. They had no idea what humans had spent the last few thousand years learning about war. The Kepler 442 system had once been home to a thriving mining colony. Now it served as a breeding ground for the Zephyrian horde's most aggressive strains. The bioships that drifted between the planets looked like massive jellyfish crossed with tumors, their surfaces constantly shifting and adapting as they prepared for the next phase of expansion. Coalition observation. Posts at the edge of the system recorded everything as the human transport ships dropped out of hyperspace. The vessels looked crude compared to sleek Coalition designs, all angles and exposed equipment where proper ships would have smooth, aerodynamic curves. "Primitive doesn't begin to describe it," commented observer Theclon from his monitoring station. "They're using chemical thrusters for maneuvering." Chemical thrusters. In combat. His colleague, a Zarathi tactical analyst named Sulvar, watched the sensor readings with growing confusion. Their ships are broadcasting identification signals on multiple frequencies simultaneously. That's completely against stealth doctrine. Maybe they don't understand proper military procedure, Theclon suggested. After all, they're only here to observe and learn. The human fleet consisted of 12 transport vessels and 4 smaller ships that appeared to be escorts. Compared to a proper Coalition battle group, it looked like a merchant convoy that had gotten lost. The bioships in the system began moving toward the new arrivals, with the lazy confidence of predators approaching easy prey. Aboard the lead transport ship, Captain Chen stood in the cramped command center watching tactical displays that would have seemed ancient to Coalition observers. Her officers used physical controls and voice commands instead of thought interface technology. "Contact on sensors," reported Lieutenant Morrison from the communications station. "Bioship moving to intercept. Estimated time to weapons range 23 minutes. Signal the fleet." "Begin landing operations immediately," Chen ordered. "All units are to establish beachheads on the primary target and begin search and destroy operations." Major Rodriguez checked his equipment one final time as the first wave of drop ships prepared for launch. His Marines were loading magazines with ammunition that Coalition forces would have considered museum pieces. Solid metal bullets driven by chemical explosives. The same basic principle humans had been using for centuries. "Remember, people," he announced over the unit communication system. "These things adapt to energy weapons. They haven't had time to adapt to bullets yet. Aim for center mass and keep shooting until everything stops moving." The dropships launched from the transport vessels like seeds from a pod, their heat shields glowing as they entered the atmosphere of Kepler 442b. The Coalition observers watched with professional interest, taking notes on human landing techniques and equipment deployment speeds. "Their atmospheric entry method is remarkably inefficient," Sulvar noted. "They're using friction heating instead of proper gravitational manipulation. The thermal signatures must be visible to every sensor in the system. Perhaps they want the enemy to know they're coming," Theclon suggested. "Some primitive species rely on intimidation tactics rather than tactical surprise." The first dropship touched down in what had once been the colony's main industrial complex. Now it was overgrown with the organic structures that the Horde used for breeding and resource processing. Massive tentacles and pulsing sacs covered the original buildings like cancer growth. Sergeant Rodriguez was the first human to set foot on alien soil. He stepped out of the dropship with his rifle ready, his his eyes scanning for targets while his squad formed up behind him. The air was thick and humid, filled with spores that made his environmental suit's filters work overtime. Movement. 2 o'clock, called out Corporal Jenkins, pointing toward a cluster of organic growths that seemed to be shifting position. The Zephyrian warrior form that emerged from the biomass would have terrified most coalition species. It stood 3 meters tall on 6 legs, its body covered in armor that shifted color and texture as Rodriguez watched. Acid dripped from mandibles designed to tear through metal, and its eyes tracked the humans with predatory intelligence. Rodriguez raised his rifle and put 3 rounds center mass before the creature could react. The bullets, simple lead and copper jacketed in steel, punched through the adaptive armor like it was paper. The warrior form stumbled backward, its bioarmor trying frantically to adapt to kinetic damage it had never encountered before. "Contact," Rodriguez shouted, and suddenly the landing zone erupted in sustained gunfire. More warrior forms emerged from the organic structures, each one a different variation as the Horde's breeding chambers tried to produce something that could survive the human weapons. Nothing worked. Bullets designed to penetrate tank armor didn't care about adaptive biology. Chemistry was chemistry, and kinetic energy was kinetic energy. The coalition observers watched their sensors in growing amazement as human forces swept through the colony complex. The same Zephyrian strains that had wiped out entire Korthani battalions were falling by the dozens to primitive projectile weapons. "This is impossible," Sulvar muttered, checking his instruments for malfunctions. "Those warrior forms have immunity to plasma, laser, particle beam, and ion weapons. They should be invulnerable to anything the humans can deploy. Maybe their immunity doesn't work against kinetic weapons," Teclon suggested, though he sounded uncertain. "Kinetic weapons are the most primitive form of ranged combat. If they were vulnerable to simple projectiles, the Coalition would have discovered that weakness months ago." But the evidence was undeniable. Human Marines moved through the Horde-infested colony like a natural disaster, leaving trails of dead bioforms in their wake. They advanced steadily from building to building, clearing each structure with methodical efficiency that spoke of extensive experience in urban combat. What disturbed the observers more than the effectiveness of human weapons was the behavior of the soldiers themselves. When Corporal Martinez took a spray of acid across his chest armor, he didn't retreat for medical attention. He called for a medic to patch the holes and kept fighting. When Private Thompson's rifle jammed, she drew a sidearm and continued advancing while clearing the malfunction. "They're not following proper casualty protocols," Teclon observed with growing unease. "That Marine has injuries that should require immediate evacuation, but he's still in combat." Major Rodriguez led his battalion deeper into the colony complex, following maps that showed the location of the main breeding chambers. Intelligence indicated that destroying the central biomass would disrupt Horde operations across the entire planet. The corridor they entered was lined with organic walls that pulsed like a heartbeat. The floor was soft and yielded under their boots, and the air was thick with spores and bioluminescent particles. Most coalition species would have required environmental suits and biological warfare protection. The humans just put on gas masks and kept walking. "This place gives me the creeps," muttered Staff Sergeant Williams, keeping his rifle trained on the shadows ahead. "Just think of it as the world's ugliest haunted house," Rodriguez replied. "Same basic principle. We go in, we kill everything that moves, we blow it up and leave." The breeding chamber they finally reached stretched out like a cathedral made of flesh. Massive bioforms hung from the ceiling like sleeping bats, while smaller organisms scurried across the floor, tending to egg clusters and nutrient pools. At the center of it all sat something that might have been the local coordinator, a brain-like mass connected to the chamber's organic systems by thick cables. "Thermite charges," Rodriguez ordered. "Standard spacing, maximum coverage. We're going to burn this whole place down." The explosives the humans used were as primitive as their weapons, simple chemical reactions that produced extreme heat. Nothing as sophisticated as the molecular disruptors or quantum explosives favored by coalition forces, but thermite burned at over 2,000 degrees and didn't care about adaptive armor or biological immunity. The charges detonated simultaneously, turning the breeding chamber into an inferno that consumed everything organic within seconds. The explosion was so violent that coalition sensors detected it from orbit, and the thermal signature was visible through the planet's atmosphere. Breeding complex destroyed, Rodriguez reported over the communication system, moving to secondary targets, but there were no secondary targets left. As the Coalition observers watched in stunned silence, bioships throughout the system began retreating toward hyperspace jump points. The Zephyrian horde, which had never shown fear or hesitation in previous engagements, was running away from a single battalion of human marines. Captain Chen received the reports from all landing sites with satisfaction that she kept carefully controlled. Her people had performed exactly as expected, but she was aware that Coalition forces were monitoring everything they did. Casualties? She asked Major Rodriguez during the post-operation briefing. 17 wounded, none critical, 0 fatalities. Medical estimates full return to duty within 48 hours for all personnel. The numbers were so low that Coalition observers initially assumed they were communication errors. A single human battalion had accomplished what entire Coalition fleets had failed to achieve, and they had done it with casualties that barely qualified as a skirmish. High above the planet, Observer Teclon stared at his instruments and tried to the emergency session of the Coalition War Council, convened aboard the massive command ship Infinite Wisdom floating in the Centauri system. Representatives from every major species sat around the circular chamber, their faces showing expressions ranging from confusion to outright fear. Admiral Takesh activated the holographic display system and began the briefing that would change galactic politics forever. 6 days ago, we authorized limited human participation in combat operations against the Zephyrian horde. The results have exceeded all expectations. The display showed tactical maps of 17 different star systems where human forces had been deployed. Each system showed the same pattern: rapid deployment, complete elimination of horde presence, and minimal human casualties. What had started as a desperate experiment had become the most successful military campaign in Coalition history. Explain to me how a single species with primitive technology accomplished what our combined fleets could not, demanded High Technician Zralmoth, their energy field pulsing with frustrated confusion. Commander Vexhai stepped forward with a data tablet that contained analysis from hundreds of combat engagements. Our tactical experts have reviewed all available footage and sensor data. The humans employ several advantages we initially failed to recognize. The holographic display switched to show combat footage from the Battle of Rigel 7. Human soldiers moved through a horde-infested city with mechanical precision, their weapons firing in controlled bursts that conserved ammunition while maintaining suppressive fire. When they encountered resistance, they adapted their tactics instantly without waiting for orders from command. First, their weapons are immune to bioadaptation because they rely on physical principles that cannot be evolved against. Kinetic energy and chemical explosions work the same way regardless of organic countermeasures. That much we understood after the first engagements, Takesh interrupted. What we need to know is why they are so much more effective than our forces were with kinetic weapons. Vexhai manipulated the display to show a side-by-side comparison of human and Coalition military doctrine. They do not fight the way we fight. Coalition military theory emphasizes technological superiority and minimal casualties. Human military doctrine appears to prioritize objective completion, regardless of cost. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The advanced species of the Coalition had spent millennia developing warfare into a precise science, minimizing losses and maximizing efficiency. The idea that someone might choose effectiveness over safety was alien to their way of thinking. Show them the Kepler Prime assault. Vexhai ordered the AI system. The holographic display filled with images that made several Coalition representatives look away in disgust. Colonel Marcus Webb led his regiment in an assault against a horde nest ship that had landed on Kepler Prime's surface. The bioship was the size of a city, protected by organic defenses that could regenerate faster than conventional weapons could damage them. Webb's solution was simple and terrifying. His soldiers had loaded themselves with enough explosive charges to level a city block and walked directly into the ship's defensive systems. They fought their way through corridors that sprayed acid, released poison gas, and shifted their geometry to confuse invaders. The human commander did not attempt to find a safe way to destroy the target. Vexhai explained as the footage showed Webb personally placing charges in the bioship's central nervous system. He calculated that acceptable losses would result in mission success and proceeded accordingly. The explosion that followed consumed the entire bioship and created a crater visible from orbit. Webb and 60% of his regiment died in the blast, but the nest ship that had been threatening the entire system was completely destroyed. Acceptable losses, repeated Takesh slowly. He deliberately planned for the deaths of his own people. Furthermore, the surviving humans showed no signs of psychological trauma from the experience. They treated it as a successful operation and immediately requested assignment to the next target. Admiral Takesh felt something cold settle in her secondary stomach. The Corthani were warriors by nature and had no fear of death in battle, but they fought to survive and win. The idea of deliberately planning to die as part of a military strategy was beyond their understanding. The briefing continued with more examples. Human forces had boarded horde bioships that no sane species would attempt to enter. They had fought continuous battles for periods that exceeded most species' physical endurance limits. When their equipment failed, they improvised weapons from debris and kept fighting with hand-to-hand combat techniques that were brutally effective. This footage is from the assault on Vega Station, Vexhai announced as new images appeared. The humans encountered a horde queen form, a bioorganism that had never been successfully engaged by coalition forces. The queen form was a nightmare made flesh, a creature the size of a battleship with natural weapons that could punch through coalition armor and regenerative abilities that made it essentially immortal. Previous encounters had resulted in the complete loss of entire battle groups. Captain Sarah Chen had approached the problem with typical human directness. She led a boarding party into the creature's living body, through wounds created by concentrated bombardment. The footage showed humans fighting through arteries and organ chambers, following crude maps drawn from medical scans. They navigated through the creature's circulatory system, Vexhai explained to the stunned audience. The internal environment included crushing pressure, toxic atmosphere, and active immune responses designed to destroy foreign organisms. The humans wore environmental suits that would have been inadequate for normal space operations, let alone combat inside a living creature. When the suits failed, they improvised breathing apparatus from captured equipment and continued the mission. Chen herself led the final assault team to the Queen Form's brain chamber, a cavity filled with neural fluid that could dissolve most known materials. The footage showed her team swimming through the corrosive environment while fighting off antibody organisms that attacked anything foreign to the creatures. Biology. How did they survive the neural toxins? Asked a representative from the Crystalline Shard Collective. Our analysis indicates that the biochemical environment should have been instantly fatal to carbon-based life. They used stimulants to counteract the toxins, Vexhai replied. Drugs that would be considered lethal to most species. The humans appear to have extensive experience with combat pharmaceuticals. The final footage showed Chen placing explosive charges directly into the Queen Form's brain tissue, while immune responses tried to dissolve her suit. She completed the mission and escaped just before the detonation that killed the creature instantly. What disturbed the coalition observers was not just the success of the mission, but Chen's behavior afterward. She submitted a routine after-action report and immediately began planning the next operation. The experience of fighting inside a living creature while being slowly poisoned was treated as just another day at work. Medical analysis of the human participants shows elevated stress hormones and neurochemical indicators consistent with enjoyment, Vexhai continued reluctantly. They appear to find combat operations psychologically rewarding rather than traumatic. The chamber erupted in confused voices as representatives struggled to comprehend what they were hearing. The idea that any intelligent species could enjoy warfare was fundamentally alien to civilizations that had evolved beyond primitive aggression. There must be some mistake, insisted Zoralmoth. No advanced species retains predatory psychological responses. It is impossible for intelligent beings to derive pleasure from violence. Takesh was studying the casualty reports with growing unease. Human losses across all operations total less than 3% killed, 8% wounded. These numbers are statistically impossible, given the level of combat intensity shown in the footage. The humans have extensive experience with what they term high-intensity conflict, Vexhai explained. Their homeworld appears to have been in a state of continuous warfare for their entire evolutionary history. They have developed tactical doctrines and equipment specifically designed for maximum lethality. Footage appeared showing human soldiers using weapons and techniques that coalition military experts had never encountered. Explosive devices designed to maximize psychological impact rather than structural damage. Toxic chemicals that targeted specific biological processes. Close combat techniques that were designed to kill as quickly and efficiently as possible. They have turned violence into a science, Takesh realized with growing horror. This is not primitive aggression. This is systematic, organized, industrial-scale warfare refined across thousands of years of constant practice. The implications were staggering. The coalition had encountered a species that was not just willing to fight, but was specifically evolved and culturally adapted to be the most effective killers in the known galaxy, and they had just demonstrated their capabilities against the Zephyrian horde, with results that exceeded everyone's wildest expectations. What are our options? Takesh asked, though she was beginning to suspect she wouldn't like the answer. The Great Chamber of the Galactic Defense Coalition had been redesigned since the last emergency session. Security measures that had never been necessary before now monitored every entrance, and the seating arrangement had been changed to accommodate a new reality that no one wanted to acknowledge directly. Captain Sarah Chen stood at the center of the chamber. No longer the dismissed applicant who had been rejected months earlier, she wore the same simple uniform as before, carried the same primitive communication devices, and maintained the same professional demeanor. But everything else had changed. The representatives who had laughed at Earth's military application now sat in careful silence, their earlier confidence replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. The humans had not just proven themselves in combat, they had redefined what combat meant on a galactic scale. Captain Chen, Admiral Takesh began formally. The Coalition would like to discuss the terms of Earth's full membership in our defense alliance. Chen nodded politely. I appreciate the reconsideration of our application. However, I believe there may be some misunderstanding about what we're offering. Commander Vexhai leaned forward in his seat, his large eyes fixed on the human officer with nervous attention. Please clarify your meaning. When we originally applied for Coalition membership, we were seeking to join an existing military structure, Chen explained calmly. Based on recent developments, it appears that structure may need some reorganization. The diplomatic language couldn't hide the reality that everyone in the chamber understood. The Coalition's military had proven inadequate against a threat that humans had eliminated with casual efficiency. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that the old structure was not just obsolete, it was potentially dangerous. High Technician Zeralmoth's energy field pulsed with agitation. Are you suggesting that Earth should assume command authority over Coalition forces? I'm suggesting that military command should be held by those with demonstrated competence in military operations, Chen replied without changing her tone. The Zephyrian horde represented an existential threat to galactic civilization. Coalition forces were unable to contain or eliminate that threat over the course of 18 months. Human forces eliminated it completely in 3 weeks. The numbers were undeniable and everyone present knew it. Statistical analysis showed that human military effectiveness exceeded coalition capabilities by several orders of magnitude. It wasn't a matter of technology or resources, it was a fundamental difference in approach and capability. Your casualties were acceptable only because your forces are apparently immune to psychological trauma, observed a representative from the Insectoid Manthe Confederation. Normal military units cannot sustain such losses without complete breakdown of morale and effectiveness. Chen's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture that made several observers unconsciously lean back in their seats. Respectfully, our casualty rates were lower than coalition forces experienced in any comparable engagement. We achieved complete victory with minimal losses by employing superior tactics and training. Superior tactics, repeated Takesh slowly. You mean your willingness to accept casualties that would be considered catastrophic by civilized standards? I mean our willingness to accomplish assigned objectives regardless of obstacles, Chen corrected. Coalition military doctrine appears to prioritize force preservation over mission success. Human military doctrine prioritizes mission success over everything else. The distinction was subtle but critical. Coalition forces had been designed to minimize losses while achieving strategic objectives. Human forces had been designed to achieve strategic objectives regardless of cost. The difference in results spoke for itself. Vexhai accessed his data tablet and pulled up reports that made uncomfortable reading. Human forces have requested assignment to additional operations. They are asking to engage threats that Coalition Command has classified as beyond current operational capability. Such as, Chen asked with what sounded like professional interest, the Devourers in the Magellanic Cloud Systems, the Machine Collective in Sector 7, the entities we detected in the void between galaxies, that our scientists believe may be remnants of the predecessor civilization. These were threats that the Coalition had been carefully avoiding for decades or centuries. The Devourers consumed entire star systems for energy. The Machine Collective converted organic species into cybernetic components. The void entities were so dangerous that Coalition policy was to avoid their territory entirely. Interesting challenges, Chen commented. What timeline did you have in mind for these operations? The casual way she discussed engaging existential threats to galactic civilization made everyone in the chamber profoundly uncomfortable. It was like watching someone plan a vacation while discussing the end of the world. You cannot be serious about engaging the Devourers, Takesh said, her mandibles clicking with agitation. They have consumed 17 star systems. Nothing can survive in their presence. Has anyone tried shooting them with enough bullets? Chen asked seriously. The question was so absurd that several representatives assumed it was some kind of human humor. But Chen's expression indicated she was completely serious about the possibility that concentrated firepower might be effective against cosmic-level threats. Captain Chen, Vexhai said carefully, I believe there may be some misunderstanding about the scale of these threats. The Devourers are not biological entities that can be killed with conventional weapons. They are more like natural disasters or fundamental forces. Everything has weaknesses, Chen replied with the confidence of someone who had spent her entire career finding and exploiting such weaknesses. We just need to identify them and apply appropriate force until the problem is solved. The human approach to warfare was becoming clear to the Coalition observers. Where other species saw impossible challenges, humans saw engineering problems that could be solved with sufficient application of violence and persistence. It was a worldview that was both admirable and terrifying. The Machine Collective has assimilated entire civilizations, pointed out a representative from the aquatic depth dwellers. They convert organic beings into cybernetic components. How would you propose to combat an enemy that turns your own forces against you? Electromagnetic pulse weapons, thermite charges, and good old-fashioned explosives, Chen answered immediately. Machines are vulnerable to electrical disruption and high-temperature damage. Standard human anti-technology warfare protocols should be effective. She was discussing the destruction of a threat that had survived for millennia, as if it were a routine technical problem. The Coalition representatives were beginning to understand that humans didn't just fight wars. They approached conflict as a solvable technical challenge that required only sufficient application of the right tools. What about the void entities? Takesh asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Insufficient data for tactical planning, Chen admitted. We would need to conduct reconnaissance operations to determine their capabilities and weaknesses. Once we understand what we're fighting, we can develop appropriate countermeasures. The idea of deliberately seeking out entities so dangerous that advanced civilizations avoided their entire region of space was beyond the Coalition's comprehension. But humans apparently viewed unknown threats as opportunities for learning rather than reasons for caution. The Coalition formally requests that Earth assume primary responsibility for galactic defense operations. Takesh announced, the words feeling strange in her mouth. We offer full resource support and logistical assistance for human military operations. It was a complete reversal of their earlier position, but the alternative was worse. If humans could eliminate threats that Coalition forces couldn't even engage, then the logical response was to give them whatever they needed to keep doing so. Chen nodded acceptance of the arrangement. We appreciate the Coalition's confidence in our capabilities. Human forces will require access to detailed intelligence on all identified threats, unlimited operational authority in designated conflict zones, and priority resource allocation for military operations. Granted, Takesh replied immediately. The Coalition had spent centuries building the most advanced military force in galactic history. In a matter of weeks, they had been forced to acknowledge that a primitive species with chemical weapons was more effective than all their technology combined. One final question, Spexhai said hesitantly. What assurance do we have that human military forces will limit their operations to external threats? The question everyone had been thinking, but nobody wanted to ask, had finally been spoken. If humans could eliminate the Zephyrian horde with such ease, what would stop them from deciding that coalition species represented threats to galactic peace? Chen's smile was polite and professional, but it didn't reach her eyes. The same assurance you had when you rejected our original membership application. We're here to help protect galactic civilization, not to conquer it. She paused just long enough to let the implications sink in. Of course, our definition of protection may be somewhat more comprehensive than what you're used to. The meeting concluded with formal agreements and diplomatic protocols, but everyone present understood the